Tonight, we examine the finale of the Chernobyl miniseries with high courtroom drama, the likes of which you can usually only see on Perry Mason or possibly Judge Judy. And also, we talk about the power of lies and, of course, the power of the KGB. And we'll figure out what Vichnaya Pamyat means. The Chernobyl After Show starts now.
You're tuned in to AfterBuzz TV, the ESPN of TV talk. Now, let the buzz begin.
Just kidding. Everyone knows what Vichnaya Pamyat means. I don't even know if we should talk about it. It's so clear what it means. We didn't even have to Google search it. We all know that apparently means eternal memory. And I don't know about you, Jeremy and Julana, but I will cherish the eternal memories of doing this after show with the both of you. It's sad that it's at an end, but of course nowhere near as sad as anything covered in any of even 1 second of this entire show. But it's great to be here. I'm Christian Blatt, joined as always by...
I'm Jeremy Dan, professor at USC Marshall Business School.
And...
Hey guys, I'm Julana Dizon.
Professor of what?
Professor of Chernobyl After Show.
Well, you are now. You
Yeah.
know, just 5 short weeks ago, you're like, I don't know.
Atomic scientist.
Let's talk a little bit about this episode. I think that this has a very different feel. We delve into the stakes and the causes, and it's there's tragedy even in this episode. It has a different feel. What did you think about this episode, Julana?
I was slightly sad that the show was ending, but we've obviously been waiting so long to.
Yeah.
This is what everybody wants to know. Everybody wants to know what happened that made it explode. So satisfied and sad was how I felt.
And what about you, Jeremy?
I was impressed. Very quality show with a lot of important meanings that we're going to talk a lot about in this show. Just a thank you to HBO and everyone that put that out there. And really impressed as well by the storytelling method. I thought it was a really interesting approach. This actually had both the beginning of the story and the end, because the really interesting use of flashback that was really key to our understanding of the whole, all the reasoning behind this.
It was very effective the way that the episode started with a flashback to, I think the assumption is earlier in that day, where we just see everyone going about their lives, people that we've seen, how terribly their lives were impacted. And, there are quite a few of them are people that are no longer with us by this point in the story. And if you want to be even more morbid about it, or not with us at this point, 30 some odd years later in real life. So I thought that was very effective. And yes, the flashbacks, seeing the series of events go into motion, and as it's talked about, the fact that Legasov makes the point for sort of the fundamental problem, which we will talk about later. But before you get to the point where that problem doesn't compensate for the other problems, you get to just everyone wanting to cut corners and being lazy, and sort of this test that they needed to get done. And I thought it was interesting to see it was kind of implied even in the first episode. You can tell by the way people were acting. It's like, okay, it's this guy's fault. These people realize what they did because they followed the orders, but they actually see all of it. I thought was great. What did you think, Jeremy?
So first of all, I don't think the people that we would find at fault viewed it as being lazy. I think they viewed it as really accomplishing the party goals and their goal with energy when they were working on that test, because they ultimately, a big part of having the test is proving the glory of the Soviet state and the efficiency of their planning and all of that. So they probably thought they were model Soviets when they were having all those discussions at the beginning. We're talking about Burkhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov.
Well, yeah, I think Dyatlov in particular is the one who's, he's like throwing the manual at the guy that say, it's like, yeah, review this. I think he knew what he had done, and it was arrogance, because we see him, he wants to be considered for boss. This was all him trying to carry favor with the higher ups, but not really wanting to get the work done. It's. I thought it was he more than anyone. It was interesting to see, his actions leading up to it.
Well, it was two different stories between that afternoon meeting, between the three executives, and then what happened when all hell broke loose. So
Sure.
two separate flashbacks.
And in this episode, Julana, we actually see the explosion, and we see all the things that had been alluded to and commented on. Just the sort of the way that the ground was shaking and all that. Talk about just your impression watching, the job they did in kind of recreating the accident itself.
I found it very interesting and eye-opening to be able to see all those parts of the reactor, what they actually looked like, because up until this point, we've just seen smoke and pieces on the ground of things.
Sure.
So I never actually knew what it looked like in real life or what the other ones look like today. So I thought that shot where you see it right before it explodes, the top of it when the pieces are moving up and
Control
down.
rods.
Right.
Attached to the control rods.
I thought that was so interesting. So I really liked that they showed all those different parts of, and where all the characters were during that whole second by second replay.
Yeah, I thought the actually seeing it, and look, it's not that this, you get the impression that this was a cheap show, but up until this point, but those sequences are very expensive, the explosions and all that thing, and I think they did a great job, and I think it was very effective to have us not see it until this one. I think you could have definitely done a linear telling of the story where we see that in episode 1, but I thought that this reveal worked so much better.
I do too. I think the reveal of the families and the idyllic situation in the town of Pripyat was well done at this point, where you sort of know what happened and you see Ludmila looking at her husband Vasily, kind of being really good with children in the neighborhood. I think then also seeing the meeting with Fomin and Brukhanov and Dyatlov, and we see the different incentives. We know a part of it is the possibility of promotion. I mean, it seems like getting a promotion would not lead you to endanger so many people, but we kind of understand the psychology of it. And also, an interesting part for me was just the explicit mention of Sitnikov. Now, we might not remember him, but Dyatlov was actually maybe going to be up for the next promotion with Sitnikov, who is he's the person that he ended up sending to look over the edge in the first episode, where we know he essentially gained fatal radiation poisoning in 5 seconds looking over the edge.
Yeah, there are so many moving pieces. I would love to have the time to watch at least the premiere again, because I think that what we saw in this episode will really you'll be better informed watching it and kind of being able to fill in some of those areas. Let's talk about the importance of the KGB, which is clearly on display at 2 points in this episode. Very early on, when we get to the present day of March 1987. And Legasov is, he ends up in the car with our KGB friend, who I don't know if that's on our cheat sheet, that gentleman, but but he's the KGB, so he doesn't want us to know his name. And we see that, I guess, in Vienna, he told the party line and he didn't speak out, because when last we left the story in episode 4, there was the notion that was the time to do it. In fact, that's what Julana told him. So it's saying, like, you're a good Soviet, you did a good job for the party, this is great, you just got to do it one more time, you're a good company man, this is going to be great. Were you at all disappointed, Julana, in the fact that Legasov didn't take that opportunity in Vienna to kind of tell the world what had happened?
Yeah, I was disappointed because Kamyuk was setting it up as this was your shot to tell the world. But kind of what we touched on at the end of our show last week, too, was that he has a lot of reasons to not want to upset the Soviet Union, like his family and everything like that.
Which now, at 5 episodes in, there's no real indication of him having a family. So it's something that they've left out of the story, which, look, you cut things out for time, but I think that would really have added to the weight of what he did and the struggle. Because now it's just like, is he trying to save his cat? Sorry, but what were you going to say?
Right. I just, that's how I felt about that. But then I also really liked in this episode how Pamyat came back and she was telling him she was talking about another jury of scientists that were going to be there. So I think that played a big factor in him deciding to tell the truth, because even, that they said it wasn't going to be accepted by the state, there were still people in that room that heard it. Whether or not it was going to be officially accepted, you can't take back hearing something and having subconscious thoughts about it.
Right. I mean, and that's just not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but that's the whole point of when you're in a courtroom and something gets stricken from the record. Well, it doesn't really matter because the people in that room heard it, especially if it's a jury trial. What were you going to say, Jim?
Well, really quickly, what was interesting about, especially what we saw from the newspaper headlines that were shown in that car, is that he actually did tell some truth. So the easiest way to hide a lie is to hide a lie with just enough truth.
Sure.
And he probably did come across as someone revealing a lot more than Soviets might be expected to at that time about some of the fail-safes that had gone wrong and a lack of training and operator error. So he was viewed as being honest about that, yet did not bring up the part about the fatal flaw in the design itself, which would cost probably billions to create and show that Soviet science, as it had been designed in decades before this kind of reactor, had not won out. It was easier to blame individuals and a little bit of training and be honest about that. And there were mistakes there, but ultimately still he did hide the design flaw.
And when he's speaking with the assistant director of the KGB, Legasov mentions that he understands his duty to the state, the Soviet Union, but there hadn't been any of the improvements, changes. So I think that a deal hadn't necessarily been made, but there was the expectation, like, I don't mind lying to the rest of the world. That's fine. We're Soviets. That's what we do. But I think he was frustrated that they didn't do anything about it.
Because Sherbina said, "We'll make a deal," and Pamyat said, "You're goofy. That's not going to happen."
You can't make a deal with the KGB.
That's where the quote came from. Again, a very powerful quote from the KGB assistant director. "We will have our villains. We will have our hero. We'll have our truth. After that, we'll deal with the reactors."
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's another one of those things that nags at him, and it goes back to, I guess that's the second episode, where they're in the meeting with Gorbachev and no one needs to say anything, and then the meeting convenes, and then we see Legasov is like, no, and he like pounds on the table, and he that's really what starts the revelation of the cover-up and the mistakes. So we I think that's a very similar moment when he's like, we're not getting the improvements. Do you, Julana, do you feel like they did a good job conveying Legasov's frustration before we even get into the courtroom? The fact that he's basically done what he's been ordered to, really, but the situation isn't going to be any better for, I think he says later in the episode, the 18 reactors in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, this brings me back to the scene where him and Legasov are talking. We were talking about this earlier, where he finds the caterpillar.
Yes.
That scene really touched me because it's kind of the first scene where you see them sort of having a friendship, not just a working partnership.
Right.
And I actually heard in an interview that there was a photo of them laughing together, like they were friends. So I think this scene in this episode really conveyed to everyone in the audience that they had some more personal friendship feelings towards each other that was more than just business. So I think what he was revealing there to Legasov was, he was kind of saying, I'm an inconsequential man, and just feeling like, you said, like everything that he's done doesn't really matter because changes aren't going to be made.
Yeah, I think that's what really weighs on him, and we know what he does ultimately because we see it in the first episode. That I think that the the only way to make sure that everybody knows what happened is, he ultimately has to kill himself. But we have a better feeling, Jeremy, as to the state of mind that went into that, because we see his hair falling out, and we're getting the sense that his health is not what it should be. And then also with Sherbina, we hear him coughing quite a bit throughout the course of the episode. So talk a little bit about how much that must have gone into his decision making about taking his own life, as we saw in the series premiere.
What's interesting, he had the line the episode before about, "I've already given my life. Isn't that enough?" And Komyuk flat out said, "No, it's not." And I actually think he was of the mindset to do what he was going to do in the scene where we first see his hair fall out, because there's so many scenes in movies where people have been exposed to radiation or they're getting cancer treatment or other things. That first emotional scene where they look at their hair and their hand is trembling because they have their hair in their hand. He pulled it out, put it on the table, pulled out a little more hair on the table, put it in the sink. I thought he was resigned and also almost empowered at that moment, knew what he was going to do. I forget the order in the episode, but Komyuk did talk about him saying, they can't function without us, the scientist, and you're Valery Legasov, and you mean something. You are the one person that could do this. And I think that and some other things started to make him believe it. And also just that really moving scene where she goes, "Here are my notes, and here are the ones from the ones still alive, and here are the ones from the ones who are dead." And I think the combination of all those things gave him the resolve. I don't think it was something in the courtroom. Maybe the final thing that pushed him over was his conversation with Sherbina, so that their work, he would know it would have value in the end. I think it was really powerful and again, a real moment of resolve from someone we hear later should have been towing the party line. It looked like he was a good party man. His father was a great party man. And this was a journey that we saw him go on and successfully end.
Let's talk about the trial itself, which it is characterized as a show trial, and I think that it is a trial designed for there to be scapegoats, namely Detlov, Buryankov, and Fomin. And I would say that the term scapegoat often implies people who are not at fault. I would say these are people who are at fault. It's just unbeknownst to them, there is, of course, something that was supposed to prevent this that they didn't know. So it's like the screw up is their fault, but there should have been this safety net, and that's sort of a very telling moment we have when Detlov is actually egging on Legasov, because so. I don't know that we need to delve. I think they did a great job of making it interesting how a nuclear reactor works with all the cards and everything. I thought it was good, but I don't know. I don't know how much to dissect that just for myself. If there's anything that stands out, feel free to jump in. But I do want to start. We can work backwards from that moment, Julana, when Detlov just knows there's something, and he's basically egging him on. It's like, well, you know it, just say it. What did you think about that level of sort of drama in that moment?
I think it was setting the stage to kind of push Legasov to subconsciously set up to tell the truth, because he obviously didn't do it in Vienna, but he's been struggling back and forth with what's the right thing to do and what do I personally want to do.
So you think that the Dyatlov egging on was a part of his decision making?
I feel like it was a part of just putting the elephant in the room, like making it a very awkward atmosphere, because if Dyatlov is pointing at him saying, you know something, then people are wondering, does he know something? Why is he talking about that?
Right. I think he had already made the decision, but that doesn't mean you're still happy to dive into it. You can definitely get cold feet and be like, am I really about to do this? And that's really the thing. I mean, Detlov, on the one hand, is clearly guilty of something. He's like, but I'm not the only one guilty. But I did, of course, enjoy his explanation. I wasn't even there. I was in the toilet. It's just like, yeah, I wasn't there. So, everybody says you were there. It's like, can I tell you? I really had to go. Which
And they're all dead.
that's true. There are very few funny moments in this entire series, but that was one that got a laugh out of me. What do you think about the way that Detloff carries himself in the courtroom scenes, Jeremy?
First of all, want to jump back just to
Sure.
the term you used, which is show trial.
Yeah.
So just to make sure, in the United States, we haven't been exposed to the concept of it as a show trial like in some other countries. We certainly have our trials that have become media circuses, but our judicial system works differently than a lot of other countries where where there's not the judicial separation, often with what we might call an executive branch or executive authority. Prosecutors are
Well, and also take into consideration that the presumption of innocence until proven guilty is very far from universal truth. In fact,
Right.
the burden of proof is very often on the defendant, and it is very often in a situation where you're given no opportunity to defend yourself.
So where we think we might understand the term of a show trial, it's actually still a little bit of a different concept. It might be almost a combination of trial plus Senate hearing, as we
Right.
think about it, for a lot of political purposes, and other forms of government have used it more as a tool in the past than I think we have in this country. But yes, Dyatlov was just frankly impressive in this. He was not cowed. He himself was resigned. We have the line from it was 1 or 2 episodes before where he essentially talked about, I'm already getting the bullet, which we know he did not, but he didn't know that then. You were saying a great move or a bold move to call out. They're holding back. They're holding back. They know it wasn't just us. He was surprising. You think people would be cowed in an environment like that, but he showcased both his strength, his bullheadedness, his words I'm not supposed to use I heard from our training. I mean, he just was a bastard.
Sure.
And I think, if you listen to the author of this on some of his interviews, he really did portray him as such, because I think he probably had a respect for his strength and his bullheadedness, but I think he references that the accounts that he saw really paint him as a very disagreeable person that had a lot of responsibility here.
I alluded to it a few minutes ago, but Julana, we have the actual moment where Sherbina has basically the coughing fit and he goes outside, and then that is where we have this surprisingly tender and genuinely affectionate moment between Legasov and Sherbina, and they kind of both talk about the sacrifice. It's mentioned earlier in the episode. Legasov says this idea that he went willingly into an open reactor, basically, and that should be enough sacrifice. But he also talks about how they could not have done it without Sherbina, which we'll see more of in a moment. But talk a little bit about watching that interaction and some of your thoughts watching the two of them together.
Right, and I apologize. I must have got confused earlier because that's what I was talking about earlier. So I thought you were talking about
it's okay.
something else.
No. I'm talking about it now because I did reference it before, but this is
Okay.
it sort of takes away from it's like a break in the trial, and they have this moment, and I to me, Legasov saying that you did the things that no one else could have done. It's like, any scientist could have done what I did.
Right.
But we needed you to actually make this happen. And do you think that kind of inspires Sherbina to stand up when Legasov was about to tell the truth? That's the aspect of it that I thought we should focus on now.
Right. Yeah, I 100% think that inspired him. Like I was saying, this is the first time that we really see tender feelings between them.
Yeah.
And it was touching. Probably one of my favorite moments of the series. But, Legasov was saying how they got sent the one good guy. And he referenced that. He said that Sherbina gave them everything they needed. Anything that Legasov asked for, Sherbina made sure that it happened, and he was the one that had the connections and could pull the strings to get those things that Legasov was insisting that they needed to take care of the reactor. So I think it was a really good partnership where in both cases, they both needed each other equally.
Legasov said, they heard me, but they listened to you.
Right.
Which was really powerful. And I mean, I had seen traces of that friendship and them realizing they were really productive together. And they've bonded in a way I think people bonding in combat. You know, the country boy and the kid from Brooklyn and the whomever that in movies and war movies you don't think are going to bond, and then they become friends, and they found themselves complementary in the end. They have been through combat and they have the injuries to show for it, and they're both going to die because of it, and that really made them simpatico.
Yeah, I mean, the stakes in terms of the potential loss of life associated with what they're doing, I mean, are higher than, any conflict that we've seen in a film, I mean, for the most part. So, I think that's very... And just to think about their initial interaction, when he has him explain to, when Sherbina asks Legasov to explain how a nuclear reactor works, is it great, now I don't need you. Yeah. So I thought that was great. And then
don't forget that I'll throw you from the plane. If you
yes, I'll throw you. I thought that was great too. The key moment that we're sort of talking about now is we have, Detloff encouraging him, and he's about to say it's very clear that he's about to say something, and that's when everybody tries to be like, no, we don't need any more out of you. That's all right, you're excused. And it just shows the importance of who Sherbina is that when he stands up and says, let him talk, everybody's like, all right, we needed somebody who was the boss, somebody of authority said this. Now it's not our responsibility. And it seems that so much of this series has revolved around, I don't want to be in trouble for this. It's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault. So they're able to pass the buck, and they do let him speak. And I do think, as you referenced, Jeremy, it's very powerful, his testimony, that it does come down to because it was cheaper. It's the point that we had explained to us, I think it was just last week, that it had those graphite tips instead of just boron going back into the reactor, and because it's cheaper. I just, because it's such a pivotal moment in the series, I just wanted to take a minute for each of us to talk about it. Julana, you first. Just sort of watching Legasov just have this impassioned plea for what had happened and why it shouldn't have been allowed to happen.
Well, I think what I got out of this scene also before he made the point that it was because it was cheaper was, at first he made the point that everywhere else in the world takes the more expensive route because of safety.
Yeah.
So he lists all the countries, and he was kind of like, this is the reason, it's because we're cheap, and everyone else is spending the money to ensure the safety.
And I don't think, Jeremy, that's an argument that would be exclusive to the Soviet Union. I know on this very show we talked about, oddly, it happened the same year, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster that happened at the beginning of 1986, and those Senate hearings, and it was just a very simple, what they called the O-rings, that when they got cold, I think they expanded, and it's like, so that's what happened. So it's these little things, these little graphite tips, just little things like that. So the parallel is kind of fascinating, that it's the same year, and it's not literally the same mistake, but it's the same sort of oversight. It was not oversight, lack of oversight, I guess, that caused the same thing. What do you think about watching all of that? Just kind of having Jared Harris there as Legasov, just bringing that all home for us.
I think that would have been, it'd be interesting to see the same kind of show about the Challenger inquiry. That'd be fascinating in and of itself.
I'm surprised it hasn't happened, by the way. I mean, the story of all the astronauts, but there's a school teacher on that trip. I mean, that alone, that it is surprising. You're right.
When he also referenced the fact that not only was it this cost saving, which you might be able to excuse, the Soviet Union was playing catch up in a way with the Western countries and especially the United States. They had a lot of victories doing it their way. They believed in their science and their scientists. The Soviet state paraded them out and their achievements, especially in space and some other areas. And ultimately, though, when he talked about that, essentially no one knew the AZ5 button, AZ5, or we call a scram button, the fail-safe wouldn't work. That was the scariest part about the whole thing, about how it was theorized that essentially would not work in this circumstance. And even when people knew about that, they didn't incur the cost. Well,
and then the explanation that the failsafe button was actually a detonator, and it's the failsafe that caused it to explode. So we get this essentially heroic testimony, but it of course is immediately explained to Legasov. There's nothing heroic about what you did. It's going to be stricken from the record. All of your accomplishments are going to be given to lesser men, and basically, no, I'm not going to kill you, but you're going to be nothing.
It was an incredible scene. So first of all, if you remember, and I think we saw this detail when he was brought to the prison where Pamyat was a few episodes ago, and there were rooms with drains in the middle. That's for when they wash down the blood and other things like that. And he was brought to a room with a drain. Yeah. So I'm sure he was looking down on it in the room, not knowing where what his next few minutes or hours would be like. But just that speech from the assistant director of the KGB was so amazing, essentially saying, we're going to kill you with indifference, and it's going to be doubly killing you because we already know you're going to die. That was a cruel cut and very powerful.
And Julana, I guess it just reinforces, as we were saying, the first thing we see him do in the first episode is the way for him to have not even a legacy from an ego standpoint, but for what he did to matter. He records the tapes and then he kills himself. What did you think about sort of the realization that was going to really be the only way out for him?
It was very shocking. I mean, obviously that's the first thing we see. So that's the first shock feeling you feel. But to have gone all this way and now understand the full extent of why and how everything panned out and how it happened, it's kind of a sad, I mean, that's a sad way to go, just to not be remembered and just have nobody pay attention to you, nobody associate with you. And for him to feel like that's his only way out is to record, here's my truth, and now I'm leaving.
Yeah.
I think he might have thought it was maybe not the way out. It was the way to bring immediacy to his words. It was the combination, his work on the actual emergency, his testimony, his tapes, and his suicide to ultimately drive the point.
So it was maybe like his sacrifice.
Yeah, and I mean,
to really set it.
And let's take a moment here to talk about sort of the little postscript, as Jeremy referred to, the Animal House portion, which is the here's what happened to everybody, and of course, this being a true story, it is very interesting. You see, one of the things we find out is Sherbina lived just a few more years, I guess 3 more years. He died in 1990, so you get the impression that Legasov would not have lived much longer. He kills himself in 1988, so he probably didn't have that much longer after that, just because of the exposure. And just fascinating things, like the fact that to this day the firefighters' clothes are still there in the basement of the hospital, and you see sort of present day someone in protective gear. They're reading, and it's like still radioactive. And so
I wonder if that was the screen. I wonder if that was Mason doing that, because he has visited it. I wonder if he took his own.
Oh, the series creator, Craig Mazin. Yeah, I mean, that would actually make sense. Just the fascinating thing that Ludmilla had been told that she would never have a child, and then they mentioned that they were wrong, and she lives with her son in Kiev. Now, the implication there is that, the son lived and is an adult, and or at least, at this point, late teens, who knows exactly when she had a kid. But were you surprised, Julana, by that revelation? That was the one that really stood out for me, because most of the other ones are like, yeah, most of these people died, and here's a couple who didn't. But that was like, oh my God, she had a kid. What did you think about, not specifically that one, but that one or any of the others that we saw at the end there?
Yeah, I was surprised about her because they said her first baby died because it absorbed all of the radiation that she would have otherwise absorbed. So it makes me wonder how much she really retained in her body, and that kid that she had, what are the effects on his genetics and whatnot.
Yeah.
Or if the baby just ended up absorbing so much of it that she's pretty much more okay than not.
And Jeremy, for me, we talked about this before the show, is the fact that all three of those divers, it was widely assumed that they died, but actually all three of them lived. One of them died a little bit more recently, but two of them, to this day in 2019, two of them are still alive. That's fascinating to me, because of anybody who, they were, up to their necks in it a few times. They spent a lot of time in there. That surprised me more than anything in the postscript. I don't know about you.
That was amazing. Supposedly, radiation exposure is predictable. There's the formula, which is the strength of the radiation source, your distance, and your time exposed. And it seemed like that time exposed would have been something that would be fatal for them. But I guess parts of it are unpredictable. Dyatlov, in spite of all the people he sent to their deaths, he was someone throwing up on the night of the event. I thought that was showing he might have gotten a fatal dose. I happen to know he survived to the trial and survived for a while longer. But imagine that someone who was amazingly exposed still survived it, the divers. So it seems like there was certainly an element to chance in all of this.
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes, but I'm going to probably take a couple extra, Steph, in the booth. But we always do a segment called Behind the Numbers here on the show, and there's only one number that I want to talk about, and we've referenced it already on this show. But it's the last thing that they say on the show, so it's worth, on the actual series, it's worth mentioning again. They talk about how difficult it is to predict and accurately portray the number of dead from Chernobyl. But the one number it's just very jarring. Julana, tell me what you think, that the Soviet official count to this day, and I know there's not a Soviet Union, but the official count is still 31. The two people who died instantly and 29 other people who were exposed there basically that night. And so their official story is that, but then it was fine because we put the fire out. That in spite of all of this, in spite of this whole series, they still say just 31 people. What did you think about that number?
That's just so crazy and unbelievable that you kind of just scoff at it. Well, at this point, it's like, of course, I'm not surprised anymore.
Yeah,
of course it is.
I'm not surprised, of course, but it made it no less shocking for me.
We know they killed tens of thousands of animals.
Yeah.
We know they had over 600,000 people committed to the cleanup of various types, what they called liquidators.
Yeah.
We know they had nearly 4,000 people that had to go onto the deadliest part of this plant, the roof with the great irradiated graphite and other materials. The life expectancy was dramatically shortened for every one of them, and hundreds of thousands and more likely millions of people in Belarus and the Ukraine had effects and were fearful throughout their entire lives. I have a friend that posted on Facebook today about how this was a very difficult show for her to think about watching, because she knows in her childhood of the fear that everyone had for many years of the way it was going to affect them.
And that's one of the things that they tell us is I don't remember the number, but just the increase in cases of cancer, and that the majority of them were children, just because they're obviously the most defenseless. And and so then you contrast that with the 31, and all you can do is throw your hands up in the air and say well, maybe it's good that there's not a centralized government like the Soviet Union.
Well, a part of that might be the fact that they there are very few programs to compensate the liquidators and the people that did the things to evacuate. They did the things to clean up. I talked about Estonia has a small program that's just a few $100s per year. Many of the other republics don't have any program set up for the people who are veterans of doing that work.
Well, having statistics is admitting failure, and even though the Soviet Union as an entity clearly was a failure because it's not around anymore, they still don't want to own up to that, and that's why I think we get that. So why we're taking these extra minutes here is just because I wanted to kind of look back on the show as a whole and just sort of any interesting just conversation about the fact that you still can't go to where this is. You can't go to the Chernobyl reactor. I think you can get close to it, and I think people have. I don't understand why anyone would go anywhere near there, but that's my understanding is that you can. And of course, the plant itself, we've seen it's basically in the concrete sarcophagus. But what are some of the other things you wanted to make sure that we addressed before we wrap up the series, Jeremy?
A mantra of this talks about lies and the truth. And it resonates in today's society. And it makes you realize that as we think about government and all the complaints people have, if you think about the elements of government, effectiveness, efficiency, transparency, and accountability. So many people complain about the effectiveness, it's not getting anything done, the efficiency, they're spending too much. But it makes you realize that transparency and accountability, ultimately, that's the only thing that's going to lead to really the first to it all. So those two might be the most important in our society, and we should fight for those at every juncture where we can.
Yeah, for me, just looking back on the series as a whole, I mean, as it's gone along, people who haven't been watching it or been meaning to watch it, I tell them the same thing, that it is the opposite of fun, but it is an amazingly well-told story with just amazing performances. I thought it was very wonderfully cast. It was just incredibly written, and it's it really came to a head last week for me when I tried to at least be lighthearted about the fact that we got to see the two worst jobs that anyone on television has ever had, which is the canine duty and sweeping the roof. But just on the whole, Julana, when we talked on our first after show here, you didn't know much about this incident. So having seen these 5 episodes, what do you think now from these 5 hours that you've spent in this world?
I feel a lot more educated, especially a lot on the ideology of the Soviet Union. And just to see throughout the 5 episodes how much they go into covering things up and telling lies just to keep this seemingly perfect, idea of their country. And I just feel like it was really eye-opening for me, like you said, not knowing that much about it. Like pretty much when I started watching, I only was familiar with the name of the accident.
Sure.
And that was about it. So really interesting. And then also interesting to know just now in present day that, like you said, there were still 3 reactors operating there at the time. And just, I feel a lot more aware about things like this now.
Yeah, and I mean, there are nuclear reactors in this country as well,
right.
And not as many as there could have been or as there once were, but not too far from where I grew up in New York State is one called High Point, and it was just sort of always there, and maybe that's why I knew much about this, but after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, you were very aware of just nuclear energy.
The United States still gets approximately 20% of its power from nuclear power plants.
And countries like France get a lot more of it, so there is always the argument that it can be safe, but you can't cut corners. I think if you can learn anything from this series, you have to spend the money.
It's a very interesting debate in our time. When it's safe,
yeah,
and it's essentially the most environmentally friendly you could in some measurements.
Yeah.
And when it goes wrong or when you don't dispose of the waste in the right way, it is by far the worst.
Jeremy, like me, you were definitely familiar with the story heading into this, and I think I knew some of the big things. It turned out that I didn't know anywhere near as much about this as I thought I did, and it was just fascinating to watch it all unfold. I knew the big bullet points for the incident as a whole and the fact that there was the cover-up, but I didn't know most of this, and it was fascinating to me to watch, to you fill in all these blanks.
The thing that stood out the most to me was kind of in the middle of the series when Jared Harris, Legasov, went through what the toll might be in terms of the tremendous evacuations and the fact that an area that today has, I think, over maybe even approximately 200 million people would essentially have to be evacuated. An area about the size of the United States west of the Rockies would be uninhabitable for thousands of years. So that was well beyond what I ever thought it was going to be.
Well, we do hope that, not an enjoyable series, but very well done. And I don't know, I think it was important. But we hope you enjoyed our conversation with it whenever you're watching this. Please feel free to jump in and comment in the archive version on YouTube or on iTunes. You can find me, I'm Christian Blatt. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChristianDMZ. Julana, where do people find you?
You guys can find me right here on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. I do the Songland After Show. And also you can keep up with me on Instagram at Julana.
And Jeremy, where do people find out more about you?
Just find me at local coffee shops here. Tell your friends to watch this show. It's the highest rated show in the history of IMDB and Rotten Tomatoes rating things. It's important for a lot of people to watch. Get them involved.
All right. Thank you so much. And, we'll see you around. Thanks, everyone.
Our founder, Kevin Undergaro, and me, Maria Menounos, would like to thank you for tuning in to AfterBuzz TV. Remember, we're not just the first, we're the biggest in the world, and we're the only destination for all your favorite TV shows. Whatever you crave, we've got it. So go to AfterBuzzTV.com and check out our lineup. Buzz you later.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of AfterBuzz TV or its owners or principals.